colonialism was not designed for development. It was not designed for justice. It was not designed for democracy. It was not designed to produce systems that respect human rights. So, for example, if you think of the colonial economic design, number one, we're supposed to be the place for cheap raw materials for colonial powers for the industrialized world. We still play that role today. Number two, we're supposed to be the consumers of technology and industrial output from the global north. We still play that role today. So, of course, these are colonial structures that persist. But we have to remember, if you don't have food sovereignty, energy sovereignty, technological sovereignty, then you don't really have full independence.
This is a small extract from what Professor Fadhel Kaboub, a renowned Tunisian economist, had to say about the hidden traps keeping Africa poor. He breaks down uncomfortable truths about food, energy, and technological dependency that most global powers would rather keep buried. Let's watch the rest of the video.
Colonialism was a system that was violent, abusive, extractive, hierarchical, non-democratic. So why do we today expect the same architecture that was not designed for justice or development? Why do we expect it to produce democracy or justice or development? It cannot. A problem that we've created, right? We're the ones who are borrowing. Our politicians and leaders are maybe mismanaging the resources, and some of it might be true. But then deeper under the surface, you realize that there are colonial structures that were imposed on us that actually reproduce the debt trap. And when you're in debt, you're dependent on external lenders and the conditions that they impose on you. And the conditions they impose on you tend to push you deeper into those structural traps. Number one, we're supposed to be the place for cheap raw materials for colonial powers for the industrialized world. We still play that role today. Number two, we're supposed to be the consumers of technology and industrial output from the global north. We still play that role today. And number three, and most importantly, we were supposed to be the place where obsolete technologies, assembly line manufacturing that they no longer need, is outsourced to us under the label of development, job creation, cooperation. But effectively what it does is that it locks us at the bottom of the global value chain, at the bottom of the hierarchy. And we still play that role today. So of course, these are colonial structures that persist, but we have to remember that colonialism was not designed for development. It was not designed for justice. It was not designed for democracy. It was not designed to produce systems that respect human rights. Not really. We have the unfinished business of decolonizing economic structures. Yes, we have our own territory and our flag and our national anthem and football teams and all of that, but that's one particular aspect of sovereignty. Elected officials, the most transparent elections and everything, and then you elect your cabinet. Now they're in office and they're sitting and they're supposed to deliver the mandate that their people have asked them to deliver. And they realize that they can't, because the number one priority on their budget is to pay interest on the debt. So they're in a debt trap. So by the time you prioritize all the basic necessities that are part of a global economic architecture that is extractive, there's nothing left in your budget. There's no fiscal space to actually meet the democratic mandate. All African countries are in the same traps. And it's much easier to co-design a Pan-African strategy to get out of those traps collectively, with collective self-reliance and solidarity, not as in, nice words about Pan-Africanism we say to each other in meetings, as an economic and geopolitical necessity. Debt. And yes, we have major problems of external debt. And here I emphasize it's debt denominated in dollars and euros and foreign currencies. The source of external borrowing, the source of that debt crisis, can be identified in three basic areas across the African continent. Number one, food deficits. Number two, energy deficits. And number three, manufacturing value-added deficits. Africa imports 85% of its food. 85% of our food comes from outside the continent, when less than 100 years ago, during colonial times, we used to be the breadbasket for colonial powers. And as a result, our farmers in the global south, in Africa in particular, couldn't compete with the subsidized wheat and corn and barley that's coming from Europe. And of course, it wasn't just Europe. It was the major economic blocs, the US, Canada, Australia, Japan, the former Soviet Union, which is why Russia and the Ukraine dominate the exports of wheat and corn globally. So as the global system was reshuffled with those countries producing the core crops, our farmers couldn't compete with the cheaper wheat or corn, so they had to specialize in something else. So we started specializing in cash crops for exports: coffee, tea, tobacco, cocoa, all the tropical fruits and every complementary food items. So today we're in a system where we consume what we don't produce and we produce what we don't consume. So that transformation didn't happen by accident. It was by design, intentional design. And it was as soon as we started to gain independence in the 1950s and early 60s. To be more specific, in 1955, when the Europeans were meeting in Rome for the Treaty of Rome, the foundation of the European Union, they said, we have a problem. We have a food sovereignty problem. We're so dependent on the colonies. So they decided to start investing in their own food sovereignty. In 1962, they introduced the European Common Agricultural Policy, which is a heavy agricultural subsidy system to prioritize the production of core crops in Europe. So maize, wheat, soybean, the core crops that every society needs for its survival, essentially. Yeah, those crops, of course, existed before this transformation, but it became almost our exclusive priority. And it's, again, by design, because today, for example, lots of people confuse the concept of food security and food sovereignty. And I'll distinguish the two, and we'll see why it's so important to be focused on prioritizing food sovereignty. It means you secure the caloric nutrition of your people, either by producing the food yourself or by buying it from abroad, which is what we do, or even worse, by borrowing money to buy it from abroad, which is part of the debt trap, or even worse, by receiving it as food aid. Food aid is the worst thing you can do to your farmers. They can't compete with free food coming from abroad. And that's precisely what happened in the 1950s and 60s. To deal with that disruption, when farmers gave up producing corn and wheat, we actually had shortages, mini famines across the continent. And to fix those mini famines for countries that didn't have cash immediately to buy food, we received food aid. And that was the final nail in the coffin of our food sovereignty. And that means now the priority is we produce coffee and tea and tobacco and bananas for exports, get dollars, and then import the wheat and corn and barley and the rice from the major subsidized producers. I'll give you one indication that this is not a coincidence. If you go to France, one of the major European producers of core crops, you look at the name of the Ministry of Agriculture. It's called Ministry of Agriculture and Food Sovereignty, not food security. The French Minister of Agriculture, during the food price disruption that happened after the Ukraine conflict, he was touring all the French media, radio and TV, reassuring the public about the situations, telling them, I don't want you to worry about our food situation. It's a temporary disruption. We'll deal with it because we've invested in our food sovereignty since the 1960s. I want you to worry about our African friends who don't have food security. Immediately switches from food sovereignty for France, food security for Africans. And it makes perfect sense because from a European perspective, if we as Africans start investing in our own food sovereignty, then we become competitors with the major producers in Europe. But that's not, advantageous to them. So it makes perfect sense from a European Union perspective that they don't invest in our food sovereignty, but they should invest in our food security. And no country can function without energy, which is the second trap. So on the energy system, energy deficits on the African continent, when we talk about energy deficits as a structural trap, today, as we transition to the renewable energy system, which is our biggest potential, by the way, we're also being denied access to the manufacturing technology to manufacture and deploy renewable energy infrastructure. And Nigeria imports 100% of its gasoline from international markets, our biggest oil producer. Angola imports 80% of its fuel from international markets. Not by accident, it's by design. What is the design? If You look at the old energy system, the fossil fuel system that we're trying to get rid of for the sake of the climate and for the sake of economic development. We've always been denied access to technology to look for oil, to drill for oil, and to refine oil. All of those technological aspects were always controlled by corporations, multinational corporations from the global north. No transfer of technology. You can buy the technology, you can rent it, you can hire, professionals from the global north to do the work, but you can't have sovereignty over the technology. And I'll give you one statistic to see how serious this is. Africa, according to IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, the last report from 2 years ago about Africa, technical report, they say with existing technologies, not with new innovations, Africa can produce 1,000 times its anticipated energy needs by 2040 and completely replace all the exports from the continent of fossil fuels. 1,000 times our needs can be met in 2040, which is the day after tomorrow. Yet, the African continent attracts less than 2% of financing that goes towards renewables globally, and we're systematically denied access to the technology to manufacture the renewable energy infrastructure with our own strategic minerals that we have on the continent. Why? Because we're supposed to extract, export the minerals to the global north, the same colonial pattern, and then import, if we have the money, the finished product. If you think about why, with this huge renewable energy potential, in the middle of a climate crisis, we've been denied access to the technology to produce 1,000 times our needs, so we can export to countries the cheapest and cleanest energy. Why are we denied this potential? There's two ways to deploy the technology. You can invest in research and development and technical skills and build your capabilities from the ground up, which will take time, or you can immediately have access to life-saving technology, life-saving not just for us, for the whole planet, that is actually available, but is being withheld intentionally, right? So why is the rest of the world withholding access to this life-saving technology? Think of this huge potential of renewable energy production, 1,000 times our needs. That means you take countries like the OPEC countries, the oil exporting countries, with their economic weight globally, with their geopolitical weight, that organization multiply its influence by 1,000. For us as Africans, we see this potential as a win-win for the whole world. But for economic blocs outside the African continent, they see that as a threat, as a risk that will disrupt the existing hierarchy, right? That will reduce their influence on the African continent. So it's a risk, it's a threat to be managed, to be minimized, to be dealt with. From an African perspective, we should be going to COP meetings, climate negotiations about debt, about financial architecture, and saying, look, we're not here for tranquilizing drugs, for false solutions, for distractions, for incremental solutions that are supposed to reproduce the status quo. Why? Because somebody like Martin Luther King Jr., he was a radical, not in the political sense of the term, radical in the sense that he wanted to go to the root causes of the problem. Because if I don't go to the roots of the problem, like the food issue, the energy issue, then we're operating at the surface level. And when you operate at the surface level, we call that superficial intervention. Superficial intervention never produces change. It's designed to produce the status quo. So when you talk about partnership, quote unquote, with the global north and these negotiations, when they say we're all in this together in a climate crisis, it's a whole series of tactics for delaying, denying, and serving as tranquilizing drugs, not to disrupt the hierarchy. And I'll give you one specific example that's related to transfer of technology. But about a year ago, almost exactly a year ago, I received an email, actually a WhatsApp message, from a senior editor at a major English-speaking newspaper that told me, you cannot believe this off-the-record interview I had with a senior official in the OECD in charge of industrialization. He said the gist of the message is the following: nobody in the global south is allowed to industrialize without our approval. No transfer of technology. And you look at the history of industrial development around the world, And you realize that this is absolutely true. And I told him, well, we kind of knew this, but thank you for giving us a confirmation in November 2023, not in 1823. So you look back at countries that industrialized and you realized that the countries that managed to catch up with the industrialized world up to a certain point were typically handpicked by the US and its allies, and were allowed to industrialize with actual financing that is favorable to them, with transfer of technology and so on. I'll give you the example of Germany after World War II. Germany after World War II, the official US policy for the first 4 years or so after the war was for Germany to become a backwards nation, never to rise again, an agrarian society. And when Marshall, the General Marshall, showed up afterward, he said, this is not a good idea for the United States. We need Germany to be an economic powerhouse to withstand the Soviet threat, right? So the Marshall Plan did a couple of things. One was transfer of technology and financing, grant-based financing to reindustrialize Germany. And that was a gift from the US. The US gifted 5% of its GDP as part of the Marshall Plan. 5% of US GDP, that's the equivalent of $1.2 trillion in today's money. And just as a point of comparison, last year at COP, the US contribution to the Loss and Damage Fund was $17.5 million, which in terms of percentage of US GDP is 0.0 nothing percent of GDP. I did the math. It's nothing. And you have to remember, the Marshall Plan after World War II, it came after a very expensive war, which Germany caused, by the way, which came after a very miserable Great Depression. And somehow the US managed to find 5% of its GDP as a gift. And today, in the middle of a climate crisis, the biggest historic polluter can't find more than $17.5 million to contribute to the Loss and Damage Fund. But back to industrialization, hand-picked countries. In addition to all of this industrialization and development support that Germany received, most people forget that the London Accords of 1955, or 53, I'm sorry, canceled 50% of Germany's debt. 50%. No country in Africa today gets a debt relief of 50%, just canceled, right? And Germany, by the way, didn't really need the debt cancellation at the time. If you look at the macroeconomic balances of Germany after the war in most African countries today, Germany wouldn't qualify for any debt relief today. So that's why some of us are looking at the Germany's Ministry of Finance and saying, look, the least you can do is reciprocate, right? Why? Because so many global South countries actually contributed to the German debt cancellation in 1953.
Wow.
And many of them are the poorest countries on the planet today. Legendary G77 negotiator Lumumba Diaping said when he was negotiating on behalf of Africa and G77, he said that kind of money is not even enough to pay for the coffins of the people who will die because of climate change. And just to put that in context.
Africa's destiny lies in our own hands. What are your thoughts on her call for unity and decolonizing the African mind? Share your opinions in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more powerful conversations, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Watch this video next. I am sure you will love it.